Take a seat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Julia.
So you're very popular here.
It's great that you could join us today, and it's wonderful to have such a large audience here as well. Thank you so much for being here. I know you have a very busy schedule, so let's get down to it. What do you make of what's happening in Canberra at the moment?
I feel like you and I could be the least informed people in this room now because we've been standing backstage without our phones, so we may be a crucial, 10 or 15 minutes behind. I don't like to comment on the day-to-day of Australian politics any longer. I leave that to my Labor colleagues who are still there and making such a fantastic job of it. But I would make some comments at sort of one level up, if I could. Which is when we see events like this in Canberra, it's easy to think this is all about Australia, it's all about us, it's all about a few personalities. But I actually think it's connected to some big trends in global politics that are worrying and need to be thought through for the future. On the conservative side of politics, right around the world, we're clearly seeing a fracturing between pro-globalisation, sort of small L liberal tendencies, and people who are more conservative and much more nation-centred. They want the globalisation to stop, and President Trump is probably the biggest exemplar of that sort of trend of, the rest of the world can go away and we'll deal with our own national problems. And so that, I think, is an interplay in politics globally. It's come to Australia, and it's come to Australia with some force, and that's what we're seeing, in Canberra and have been seeing in Canberra for some time.
Okay, well, to be a bit more specific then, do you think New Zealand will be able to handle the huge influx of Australians wanting to migrate there if Peter Dutton becomes Prime Minister?
I can understand, being out of the two of us, I was always the diplomat. I'll just put that out there now. I can understand why people would want to go in and live in New Zealand given the leadership of the current Prime Minister and to be there in a nation that's showing to the world that you can be a Prime Minister, a woman, a mother and still be doing it all. I think it's fantastic. I'm getting to see her in New York and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Okay, as Martin Bean has just said, it was just over 5 years ago that we had the privilege of you as Prime Minister launching the Centre for Innovative Justice. And I've got to be frank with you, we were on tenterhooks at the time because rumours were rife about a challenge to your leadership, and the date you were actually due to open our centre was the 15th of March, or the Ides of March, and Julia Caesar knows about that. But I guess because of what's happened in Canberra this week, and in fact what's been happening to the Office of Prime Minister over the last decade, do you think we're seeing the new norm?
I think a lot of what's happening now is a new normal. I do remember that occasion of opening the centre. I particularly remember that you had one of those human statues, people who are in silver and look like they can't move. You had a woman dressed as Justice, and at the pivotal moment she sort of wielded the sword, causing a bit of alarm in my security detail in that moment. So yes, the memory's pretty sharp in my mind. I think there's a lot of tendencies about politics here and around the world, the fracturing of the political right that I've spoken about, the media cycle having completely shifted because of new technology and the rise of social media. I think people feel like they get to know their politicians more quickly than they ever did before, they get over them more quickly than they ever did before, and that cycle is there. I think it's harder now than it's been in ages past to build and hold a political consensus for really deep-seated reforms. Not impossible. I mean, we did it around some very big things, carbon pricing, National Disability Insurance Scheme and the like, so it's not impossible, but it's harder than it used to be. So it's like everywhere, the temperature at which the whole thing is cooking has gone up.
Okay, so many people, I guess, who live in Canberra are in somewhat of a bubble. How do you explain, or can you explain, really, the disconnect between what's happening in federal politics at the moment and what's actually happening out there in the real world? I mean, what is the public expected to make of the circus that's Canberra at the moment?
I think people are very anxious in today's world, and that anxiety both reflects into and is reinforced by some of the cycles of politics. And there's, you know, a fair few things to be anxious about. I mean, the pace of change is just astronomical. You know, the change in digital technology, and they tell us under Moore's law and all the rest of it that we will continue to see the doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling of the computing power in the world. It's going to change how we live, how we work, how we socialise, how we interact with our families. It's done that already, and it's going to do it more. Artificial intelligence, the future of work, changes in the globe. You know, America used to be the, you know, preeminent winner of the Cold War, and now there are new fracture lines everywhere. So there's a lot to make people feel like this is a pretty scary and difficult world. How do I find my place? Will my children have a better life than I did? And people want an answer. And the hard truth of politics is there's not a simple answer. You know, if anybody actually had the, you know, 10-word sentence, if we just do X, everything will be all right. If anybody's the custodian of that sentence, well, I haven't met them. And I don't think that they exist. You know, it's complicated. And because it's complicated and the nature of the times is fractious, people look at politicians and say, you know, I want to see you provide answers, and often politicians can't. And it's that anxiety that in some ways is leading, at the same time that it leads to political instability here. Clearly, Prime Minister May in the UK, the cycle of rumours about the leadership there happens very rapidly as well. Whilst it feeds that, it's also feeding this hankering for a sort of strong man, the person who looks like they've got all of the answers. And President Trump's played into that. Some far-right politicians in Europe have played into it, and so have some far-left politicians. And I think we've all just got to take a step back and a little sort of calm down and say there's not the one answer, and it is going to not be easy to work through this set of changes and try and find a new democratic rhythm that lets us do that. But I'd really, you know, it's not for me to carry a case of defence for the Liberal Party in Canberra, and I'm not going to. But I think it can be a little bit easy to narrow down and see this like a, you know, footy contest and a few key players, rather than look up at the big trends that are driving it.
Many deposed senior figures in politics harbour intense animosity, and they seek vengeance, and I think we're probably seeing that in Canberra at the moment. You have certainly been conspicuous in your silence since leaving politics. How difficult has it been for you to be silent from the sidelines in relation to politics generally?
Well, my dog Ruben's heard some zingers along the way, and he's got, you know, that many dogs have it, that look that he's listening, like you'll talk and he'll put his head on the side, and then as you keep talking, he'll put his head on the other side, like he's absorbing it. So I have imposed that on him and other members of the family, but I was very clear when I left politics that I wasn't going to join the commentariat, that once you're sort of gone, you're gone, and you have to let those who are still on the field and in the contest get on with it. And I've held true to that and held my nerve about it, even when it's required some biting of my bottom lip. And I'm pleased I did because one, you know, I think it's, you know, sort of better for the nation to not have people sort of harping from the sidelines. But it's certainly been better for me personally. And one of the things I learned as a lawyer at Slater and Gordon 100 years ago when I was young, you know, we'd have a first free consultation and you would have people come in you know, with 2 lever arch files of documents, and I'd be doing employment law, so it'd be about a dispute in their workplace, and they'd, you know, sort of put them on the desk and say, oh, it all started 15 years ago. And you'd go, gee, this is a half-hour free consultation, so we're going to have to keep the pace moving. And, you know, maybe something bad had happened to them. And maybe they might have even had a legal case, you know, back at the time it happened. But you did really feel like not being a lawyer in that moment, just being a sort of, you know, human being, given a human response and saying, you know what, you'd feel a hell of a lot better if you went home, threw those lever arch folders full of documents on a big bonfire in your backyard, put it behind you and look forward to the next stage of your life. And having seen that with people who came to me as a lawyer back then, I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to be the person sitting at a Labor Party meeting in 15 years' time going, you know, it all could have been different if on that Tuesday he did this and she did that. You know, you've just got to, you know, that was then, this is now. There's a lot of life to live and I'm getting on with it. Okay, well, to stay the course as a politician, you've got to be pretty clear about what you want to achieve. You've got to sort of have a roadmap. With me, it was my time doing Aboriginal legal aid work in North Queensland, sort of set my social justice roadmap, alight really. And with you, it was education. Do you reckon there are too many politicians these days who aren't actually clear about why they're in politics? I think who's gone into politics has always been a mix of, you know, people driven by a broad set of values. You know, they absolutely believe in, you know, progressive political ideals or conservative political ideals. People who are cause specific, you know, they got into it because they really wanted to change X. And people who, frankly, are more in it for the, you know, the applause, the, you know, Hollywood for ugly people bit about it. And the... Why did you look at me when you said that? I'll leave the audience to draw their own conclusions about that, Rob. I'm pretty sure you were looking back at me too. You know, but if you're in it for that, you've really made a bad career choice because, you know, there's nothing surer in politics than, you know, to use a Tony Blair saying that he's fond of, if you decide, you divide. And in politics, you've got to make some big decisions, and when you decide, you divide. And so audiences don't uniformly applaud. You go to lots of audiences where no one's applauding. You go to audiences where people are booing. And, you know, not too many people's political careers end happily with a victory lap. Most people end it because their party turns on them or they lose an election. You know, the day after I was voted out as Prime Minister, I took a condolence call from Paul Keating, whose opening words to me were, "We all get taken out in a box, love." And I thought, if that's meant to make me feel better, Paul, I'm not 100% sure you've quite hit the mark. But, you know, it's true. Not many people get to exit the way they want to. So if it was about the applause, if it was about the feel-good, that'll never sustain you. The only thing that will ever really sustain you is that sense of purpose. And, you know, it can be Labor values, it can be education or access to justice. It can be, and many people step into politics because of this, you know, an attachment to their local community, their local electorate, and they definitely want to see a few things change for the community that they live in and love. All of those will be very sustaining motivations.
I think everyone would agree that the policy dilemmas facing us now as a community are very complex, whether it be climate change, family violence, poverty, inequality, lack of faith in our institutions, and the solutions require a sophisticated policy and political response. Can this actually occur in the current climate when the game of politics seems to be far more important than getting the outcomes we need and deserve?
Well, I feel like I'm the politicians' defenders today, but to keep doing that, I think there is a cycle here that has become very reinforcing between the media and the politicians, and it's not quite right to heap it all on the shoulders of the politicians. Now, that isn't to say that people don't get some joy in the game. And, you know, there were question times that I did as Prime Minister where you feel like you've dominated the Parliament, where you've delivered some lines which will make it on the nightly news and be much talked about, that you don't get pleasure in that you feel like you've dominated the game. But, you know, a lot of that and the speed of it now is really about the media, and that means it's really about us. You know, what do we want to consume on our news feeds? Because whatever we say we want to consume and show that we want to consume through our demand, media will provide it. So if you're really saying, I want an updated story every 15 minutes, then you're going to get rubbish most of the time, because, you know, there are exceptional days like today where every 15 minutes matters. But most political days, you know, government can't run quickly enough to do things every 15 minutes. Nothing has changed in 15 minutes. Nothing might change for weeks at a time, months at a time, as governments labour on big policies or put the budget together. And so if you're looking for that hit every 15 minutes and the journos are providing it, then they're writing rubbish. To get their faces in the media, their names in the media, the politicians will step up for the cycle and try and deliver a cutting grab or something that's going to run for the next 15 minutes, and on it goes. I think we've all got to, you know, sort of take the responsibility for deepening our knowledge base, deepening our information sources, and trying to drive some cultural change in the media and consequently in politics. I've joked with people in the past that it's a bit like the advent of all-you-can-eat restaurants in Australia. When they first came here, this audience is probably too young to remember that, but there was a time when restaurants moved to all-you-could-eat restaurants, and you pay a fixed price for all you could eat. And, you know, we all went a bit mad for a while, and you'd be standing there at the donut machine with the ice cream going, I don't even particularly like donuts, and you know, I've already eaten so much I feel a bit sick, but it's all you can eat, so I'm going to eat that donut. I think we're a bit like that with our news media consumption at the moment, and just like we moved on from that in restaurants, you know, I want less, higher quality, customised to my tastes. I think we're going to get there in media, and that will be a happier age.
Okay, well, I think it was the British 17th century poet George Herbert, and as you know, I'm always quoting poetry, Julie, who said, living well is the best revenge. When I see you now strutting the stage with the likes of Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel, Malala, Charlize Theron, Rihanna, it looks to me that you've left politics well behind you and are now living your best life. Are you?
Oh, there's lots I miss about politics, and, you know, lots I'm wistful for, but there are some things about it, including the sheer relentlessness of it, that I don't miss. And I have taken, you know, the things that I was most passionate about and most believed in, particularly education, into this new life. And that does mean that I spend time with others who are prepared to lobby on education causes, including Rihanna, who's become the global ambassador of the major global fund that I chair that supports school education in developing countries. So it's around an $800 million a year fund working in 67 developing countries. And, you know, I don't know anything about the music industry. I may not have known many Rihanna songs before she became our GPE Global Ambassador, but I have had the opportunity to travel with her and to watch her use that power of celebrity to make a difference to girls and boys who live in countries where currently they've got no prospect of going to school. I did travel with her in Malawi, and it's a real testament to the power of globalisation that you can be in a girls' high school in Malawi with Rihanna, and every girl knows who she is. Every girl is crowding in to say hello to her. Half of them are singing Rihanna songs. We went to a primary school where kids were sitting 80 in a class. The classrooms were constructed from mud bricks. You know, not enough teachers, not enough books. You know, the chance of a girl finishing high school in Malawi is 1 in 10. Many of them don't finish primary school. And, you know, she wanted to make a difference to that. So, and actually I remember being in the primary school with her because I was talking to the school administrators as she was dancing in and out of classrooms saying hello to the kids. And I said to the school administrator, how old is this classroom? And she said, the village built it in 1961. And I said, it's as old as I am. I was born in 1961, only to hear Rihanna run past me calling over her shoulder, don't be telling us your secrets, girlfriend. Very, very cute. But she made a difference to our ability to raise more than $2 billion in February for GPE.
Fantastic. Okay, is it possible for you to tell our audience what an average week, if there is such a thing, in the life of Julia Gillard looks like in 2018? Is it full of, I don't know, Qantas lounges and the inside of aeroplanes, or do you spend a lot of time back home in Adelaide with your feet up, watching another Bulldogs defeat on the TV with room? Is there an average week? Give us some sort of idea.
It was inevitable, wasn't it? That, the Bulldogs crack.
That was crack, she said, not crap.
I really have kind of a couple of different ways of having an average week. I spend a lot of time overseas because I chair the Global Partnership for Education, because I'm building at King's College in London a Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And I do give speeches and do other things overseas. So, you know, by the time I'm sitting down with my family for Christmas lunch, you know, I've probably spent 5 months of the year overseas, and we try and organise that in sort of bigger blocks, so I'm not coming and going. You know, for example, when I'm working at King's College, I'll do that for 4 or 5 week blocks. So I'll be, you know, over there looming up in coffee queues next to Australians who are like, what are you doing here? And that's all good fun and really motivating work. Back here, when I'm at home, I live in Adelaide and all of my family are there. So I could be doing anything from, you know, paperwork in the office to hanging out with my great niece and nephew, Ethan, who just turned 5, and Isla, who just turned 3. I've been waiting to see how long it was until the penny dropped with Ethan and Isla that maybe there was something a little bit different about their Aunt Juju, which is what they call me, because whenever we go out together, people come up and say, can I get a photo? And I've watched Ethan look, and he looks, and they want photos with me, but not with his mum or not with his dad, so why? But the penny didn't drop until I went to his kindergarten, and there was a bit of a frisson around that. And he was knowledgeably heard to say, he asked Jenna why, and Jenna, his mother, said, oh, you know, Julia used to be boss of Australia, trying to explain it to him. And then Ethan was knowledgeably heard to say the next day to his little kindy mate, my Aunt Juju used to be boss of the world. So we'll have to correct that impression at some point, but I'm kind of enjoying it at the moment. So family time at home. I also spend a lot of time here in Melbourne and around Australia because I chair Beyond Blue, and we're very keen, I've got the badge on, very keen to get the message out that we do need everybody to be talking about, thinking about and acting on their mental health.
Anything in particular you miss from your previous political life?
Yeah, I mean, Look, I went into politics because I, believed in change. I was passionate about education. On the way in, if anybody had said, what's achievement going to mean, I would have said if I got to be a Minister for Education or for Workplace Relations in a Labor government, then that would be fantastic. I mean, I got to do both those things and a hell of a lot more. So, I miss the ability to put my values into action and to make big decisions that make a difference for my nation and for the Australian community. I miss the interaction with the best of my colleagues because there's a real, forged bond of people who are doing tough things in difficult circumstances that you don't quite replicate elsewhere in your life. So I do miss that. But it's, a time of new opportunities and not exactly the same, kind of daily mincemeat grind that politics is.
There is no question that you achieved an enormous amount, both as a minister in government and as boss of Australia. Aside from launching our Centre for Innovative Justice, what policy or policies do you think you're involved with that have had or will have the most impact and endurance?
Well, look, I'm very proud of a number of them. Obviously, the Centre for Innovative Justice is right up here. So anything I'm going to, talk about now pales in comparison. I'm very proud of the school funding reforms and other associated reforms we did, the major changes to school education. I'm very proud of the major changes we made throughout the life cycle of education, from early childhood through schools, vocational education and training, and universities. We wanted to bring an education revolution, and I think seriously, when people look at the degree of change we achieved, we did. Now, not all of it survived, but a lot of it survived, and one of the things that does have me saying zingers to Reuben the dog is, everybody now in Canberra competes to be the best advocate for needs-based funding of schools. Before we did those reforms, the Conservatives were completely opposed to needs-based funding of schools. So if you leave behind a system where the political debate has moved on, that you can't really be in it unless you're saying, I'm the best needs-based advocate, I'll take that. I'm pretty proud of that. I'm proud of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I always imagined that in implementing a change as big as that there would be difficulties, and of course there are, but it's the right system for the nation's future. I'm proud that we did the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in institutional settings. And, I do meet so many people for whom that's changed their lives. Finally, getting to tell their story to people who believed them, that's changed it for them. And I'm proud too of some of the foreign policy achievements. We did lay down the Australia in the Asian Century policy paper. We did improve our relationship with China and with the US. And for all the hurly-burly that there's been since, really, the architecture we designed and the settings in that policy paper have continued to drive Australia's kind of outlook on the world. So they're all important to me as I look back on it.
Just in relation to the Royal Commission, it must have been an extraordinary experience meeting people who had been survivors, meeting families of people who'd been sexually abused, and you've said that that the Royal Commission is going to have a long-term impact in relation to many of those people. We actually have a message from someone who's very grateful for the leadership you showed on this particular issue.
Julia Gillard was so brave making that call. It was unpopular. There would have been so much pressure from the church hierarchy not to have a Royal Commission. There would have been colleagues, there would have been a whole sea of people pushing against it. And she stood up and she did it. So, such bravery, leadership, astounding. And she went against the flow, and look at the legacy that's come from that. We've had so much change in legislation. It's made it fairer, on victims. It's taken the power away from these institutions that flaunted their power in every wrong way you could imagine. And that's what she came up against. And she fought it by doing that. And by fighting that, Julia was fighting with us and for us. So good on you, Julia. You're wonderful. Thank you.
So as we know, that's Chrissy Foster, a fierce campaigner for child sex abuse victims, who joins us today in the audience. Thanks for being here, Chrissy. Julia, you've spoken often of how the values you learnt in your early life shaped and informed the changes you tried to achieve in politics and really helped keep your eye on the long game. What was it about your childhood and family life that instilled such a strong sense of values in you?
There we are, the Gillard family, absolutely. I'm the little one, that's my sister Alison there, and my mum and dad, John and Moira. I think it was a series of things. I mean, one, there were the two girls, and our parents, taught my sister and I to, aim big and to, think about our futures and think about what we could do in the world. Which given, I'm born in 1961, I was in school in the 1960s, 1970s. I mean, there were lots of girls in that era who weren't being told that, who weren't being taught that. They were being told, you don't have to worry about this work thing very much because realistically your future will be as a mother and as a housewife. You'll probably work for a few years, but once you're married, that'll be it. And so I think that culture that you can be the architect of your own life is the absolute foundation stone for me. And then a love of learning and a love of education for different reasons. Neither my father nor my mother completed high school. Dad simply because of poverty in the coal mining village he grew up in. Mum because she was very unwell as a child and there were just no support systems in those days to, help a kid that was routinely out of school, so she gave up. And they were very intelligent people and they always lived with this kind of sense of, what if we'd got to finish school, what if we'd got more opportunities, what could the other life have looked like, the one we're not getting to live. And they weren't, they lived long and successful lives, so they weren't embittered by that. But they didn't want my sister and I to die wondering. They wanted us to have the benefits that the best of education could. And, what's remarkable in some ways is having that family make the decision to migrate to Australia and settle in a suburb. That meant when I walked down the road and went to the local state schools, which is what I did, that they were great schools. I mean, the serendipity of that, just, talk about sliding doors, any of those things could have been quite different. And if they'd settled in many other suburbs of Adelaide, the local schools would not have been great schools. And it sort of ignited in me a passion because I understood that, I understood their love of learning and I came to understand more as a student politician that there was education inequality. The lottery of that, the postcode lottery that I was going to be set up for life because I got to go to a good school and a kid just like me could be missing out. It was that really sparked the passion that took me into politics. So all of those things.
Another childhood experience that helped inform you later in politics, as you said, was your parents worked, your dad with psychiatric patients and your mum with the elderly. You said before that you grew up with no real fear of difference and that creating the NDIS felt like coming full circle. There's a photo I want to show you. Do you remember this photo?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, that's a photo taken by Sophie Dean, and that photo now hangs in the Museum of Australian Democracy. We also have a message from Sophie for you.
Thank you, Julia Gillard. I love you, Julia Gillard.
That's fantastic. Well, she's grown from, I knew that the years were passing, she was growing up to be a young woman, but when I met Sophie, we were campaigning, you know, as a government we wanted to do the NDIS and we were campaigning to get the intergovernmental agreements necessary. We couldn't do it without, you know, this lumbering thing called COAG actually engaging and states and territories saying, yes, you know, we're going to do it. And so she joined me with other campaigners for the NDIS for a coffee just in the city near Treasury Gardens. And she took a shine to me. She was sitting on my lap, I was chatting with her, and she was running around with a camera, and I just literally bobbed down for 10 seconds and she took that shot, and just a fantastic, you know, I think the lack of staging of it, the naturalness of it probably showed. And I was so pleased for her when it ended up being such a recognised photograph.
Fantastic. Yeah. Establishing things like the Royal Commission and the NDIS, I guess, are rare acts of leadership where the government makes a decision and then brings the public along with it. Why does it seem so hard for many governments to show such leadership today, whether it be the National Energy Guarantee or even, you know, the law and order debate, for instance? How do we convince the current and future breed of politicians to actually base policy on evidence and not the lowest common denominator?
I think to get a big thing done requires a coming together of a lot of elements, and often politics doesn't give people the space, and politicians don't have the patience to line all of these things up. You know, you need a mobilised constituency for change in the community. And what is remarkable in many ways about the National Disability Insurance Scheme is that the community of people with disabilities and their carers got out and campaigned. I mean, you know, you'd go to halls like this one full of people with some of the most profound disabilities and their carers, and they'd made extraordinary efforts to get there in large numbers to have their say in the Australian democracy. So you need, you know, community campaigners for change. You need politicians who are prepared to get it all lined up. So, you know, to get thoughtful inquiries done. You know, the Productivity Commission was important in the NDIS, thoughtful policy work. And then you need that to come together at a moment that you can, you know, shape the politics around it. And ultimately, you know, the people who had doubts about the NDIS saw that come together, a case for change that was rational, a community want and a community campaign, and so people went with it. And went with it, to be fair, across the political divide. I mean, you know, I'm glad that I had an interlocutor like Barry O'Farrell as Premier of New South Wales. I mean, he signed on to our school reforms, he signed on to the NDIS, and once he did that, then the momentum was always going to be one way. So, you know, you can win it across the political spectrum. What you can't do is kind of throw your hands up when it gets tough. I mean, we had some really tough times, you know, carbon pricing, unbelievably tough. And, you know, whilst the legislation didn't survive the change of government, you know, everything about this current tempo of politics is telling you we're going to be back there. We're going to be back there with the need to put a price on carbon. It mightn't be exactly the same mechanism, maybe it'll be a shadow price, but to put a price on carbon to send the right signals so that we have a low emissions intensity future. So, you know, I think if people say, oh, we can't get things done because of this or that, rather than trying to puzzle the way through to how do you move those obstacles, then that's where politics breaks down and doesn't deliver results. It does mean you've got to be really selective, because however long you're there, it'll only be a finite time, it'll pass very quickly, and you can't do everything. And we needed to be really clear, you know, carbon pricing, you know, particularly the school, we did a lot of school reform, but the capstone was the school funding reform, the NDIS. These were going to be the big legislative pieces in the Parliament that we were going to put our muscle behind.
Okay, I want to show you a short video that you probably haven't seen before, and probably no one in this audience has seen before, but I just want to show it to you now.
I'm kind of worried now.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to oppose the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition. And in so doing, I say to the Leader of the Opposition, I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever. The Leader of the Opposition says that people who hold sexist views and who are misogynists are not appropriate for high office. Well, I hope the Leader of the Opposition has got a piece of paper and he is writing out his resignation. Because if he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives, he needs a mirror. That's what he needs. I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition went outside in the front of Parliament and stood next to a sign that said, "Ditch the witch." I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition stood next to a sign that described me as a man's bitch. I was offended by those things. Misogyny, sexism, every day from this Leader of the Opposition. Every day, in every way, across the time the Leader of the Opposition has sat in that chair and I've sat in this chair, that is all we have heard from him. You've been delving in the archives for very hard to find footage, Halsey.
Yes. I'm a great researcher. As you know, and you may not have known it at the time, but this was such an important and empowering speech for millions of women all over the world who have been emboldened by your calling out sexism for what it is. Of course, we still have a long way to go as a society to address misogynist attitudes across all sections of community life. How do we continue to make the fight relevant?
I'm really optimistic about this fight, actually, and I'm really optimistic about it because I think there's more energy now amongst younger women for this fight than there used to be. And I think, you know, the Me Too movement around the world is one expression of that, and using the new technology to get a case for change out there. I think there was a period, and you know, many of us succumbed to this. In some ways, I succumbed to it myself. You saw a pace of change for women, and you thought, okay, well, it's all, you know, sort of happening now. And if we just wait, we're going to be in a sort of self-correcting world where more women in politics will mean more women in politics, which will mean it's equal for women in politics, and more women in management will mean more CEOs and corporate board members, and it'll all be equal. Only to find that the years were going by and that rate of change was actually pretty glacial. It wasn't like that, it was slow. And only to find that as overt sexism got buried deeper because people knew they couldn't do or say some of the things that had happened in the past, that, you know, unconscious or covert sexism came more and more to the fore. And, you know, I think young women today are onto this now. You know, they get it. They watch dynamics in their lecture theatres, in their tutorials, at work, online. They watch dynamics and the sexism is obvious to them and they don't want to live with it and they want to see it changed. And we needed that new energy to come into the sort of public square to make sure that we carry this through. So I'm really optimistic about it. And one of the things I'm doing at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is we want to deepen the research base about what enables women to come through for leadership and what enables their leadership to be fairly evaluated. And, you know, we're doing some things that really do make you sort of sit up and think this through. We did a study of the media reaction to the election of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister way back when, and the media reaction to Theresa May, the second female Prime Minister in the UK. And the commentary in the media was more gendered for May than it was for Thatcher. Like, extraordinary. And you think, what explains that? I think partly it's that there's not that reserve about politicians anymore, so people wouldn't have commented quite so much on what Thatcher looked like or what she wore, whereas now that's kind of, you know, absolutely in the media reporting, but more gendered. We're looking at things like some of the learning algorithms, things like Google Translate, and when it is translating from a language that doesn't have gendered pronouns into a language that does, it picks up the inherent bias in the users. So if it is translating a word like surgeon back into English, it will use the pronoun he. If it's translating nurse, it will use the pronoun she. You know, so like all of these really interesting sort of windows on the world which tell us that there's, you know, a hell of a lot going on that shapes, you know, almost without us knowing, shapes the world in a gendered way. And I think the more we can surface that, the more we can get people talking about it, the more we can get the unconscious bias to be recognised, then the easier it will be to create a gender equal world. And so I'm very, you know, I think that speech, hopefully at some point in the future, is remembered as an artefact from a time when things used to happen in a gendered way in politics, and it's looked on as a bit of a curiosity from a future in which gendered things no longer happen in politics.
Julia, you came up through the ranks really of state politics as John Brumby's Chief of Staff, something that you and I both have in common. And our political careers really took off after that experience. You always maintained that you were John Brumby's best Chief of Staff.
I actually think John Brumby might have maintained I was John Brumby's best Chief of Staff.
I'm glad you said that, because we actually have a message from John Brumby.
Oh no.
Well, Julia was a brilliant Chief of Staff. I always think I was so lucky to have her as a Chief of Staff. So she was great with people, intelligent, forward-looking, brilliant on policy, fantastic on strategy. And she was really, you know, as good as you could get as a Chief of Staff. But when I look back on that time, there was, I think, well, maybe there was one who was perhaps as good, maybe even better. And his name was Hulls, Rob Hulls.
The facts speak for themselves.
Yeah, an entirely unprompted response, yeah.
I had to take out a second mortgage for that. Julia, just before we finish up, since your Prime Ministership, in many ways, I've got to say, things have gone backwards. We've got rising inequality, increasing wealth disparity, insecure employment, mental health and homelessness rates are increasing, an emboldened far right, I guess, with all that entails, including speeches like, you know, Fraser Anning's last week and the debacle that's happening in Canberra this week. Why do you think we're seeing these trends, and what can we in this audience and the wider community do about it?
I think we could be heading for a federal election that will be, you know, quite ugly around questions of race. There's been no secret made that there will be campaigning on law and order questions, you know, putting to the forefront people's race and ethnicity rather than the crime. And I think it's sort of incumbent on all of us, when emotions get worked up around those things, to be voices of reason, you know, pointing methodically to the evidence rather than getting swept up in it. And it sounds, you know, that in some ways sounds passionless. You know, we'll be quoting the statistics when others are actually using the slogans. But over time, I believe reason tells. You know, people are persuaded of reasonable things. You know, you look at the community's ability to respond to, you know, when I was growing up, actually a family member in our extended family, in my niece's husband's family, there were doctors in the 1950s that for a nervous person who turned up would say to them things like, you know, maybe you should take up smoking, just calm yourself down a little bit. A female family member in that family was told precisely that and actually died of lung cancer. But, you know, science, reason, convinced communities, we changed attitudes, you know, smoking rates are now a fraction on what they used to be. We're capable of responding to reason over time. We're capable of responding to, you know, good arguments for change, what needs to be done in the community in the future. The NDIS is a good example of that. We're capable of hearing heartfelt cries, and the Royal Commission, I think, is a good example of that. So if we're capable of doing those things, I think we need to keep that about us as we move into what will inevitably be an even more fevered political environment, and not let people stigmatise or exclude or demonise for political purposes. And, you know, I'm optimistic that, you know, there's goodwill at the hearts of most Australians. We've actually been a democracy that could welcome people from all parts of the world and build a peaceful, harmonious place. I think we never take that for granted, but we always carry that spirit with us, and we need to do that together.
Beautiful. Thanks for that great advice. We are going to open it up to a few questions from the floor, but before we do, I just want to play a quick word association game with you. If you could respond with your immediate thoughts, just one or two words. First is Barack Obama.
Oh, he's gorgeous.
Second, Michelle Obama.
She's also gorgeous. And both of them are incredible. I mean, I'm not doing your one-word test very well, am I? Both of them are incredible individuals and forces for change. Obviously, they were in office, but still are.
Hillary Clinton.
She is a lovely woman, warm, funny. Everything you've ever read that says she's not those things, the things that were used against her in the campaign, aren't true. And her amazing dignity in this time, I think, is remarkable.
Jacinda Ardern.
She's fantastic too.
The Queen.
I enjoyed meeting and dealing with the Queen because it's the living history thing. You ask her about any event in the 20th century, any event in the latter half of the 20th century into this century, any global personality, and she's met them. You know, incredible.
Bill Shorten.
Next Labor Prime Minister.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Maybe when I run into him somewhere, we will be assuming that body posture again. I do look a bit consoling there, don't I?
Donald Trump.
One word. I'm waiting for the midterms. I think the word is midterms.
A few more to go. Tony Abbott.
Well, I've said a few words about Tony Abbott in the past, all of which
To Reuben?
No, the ones I might have said in Parliament, words I stand by, but I suspect any word I could come up with right now would be a mild version of what's being said about him by his colleagues in Canberra.
And just two more. Kevin Rudd.
That's a much used photo, and in some ways, people say the camera doesn't lie. I think the camera lies a lot. I worked with Kevin as his deputy opposition leader. He got some incredible things done as Prime Minister. It was a privilege to sit behind him as he delivered the apology to the stolen generations, for example. Clearly, we don't see eye to eye about some matters of history, and that is what it may be.
And finally, Peter Dutton.
Something tells me we'll be seeing a bit of that photo in the future.
Okay, can I thank Julia for joining us, but I do want to open up to questions from the floor. We have about 5 minutes, that's all, in relation to questions. We have some roving mics, both upstairs and downstairs. So do we have any questions from the audience? Just raise your hand over here on the right.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that. You mentioned sometimes it feels like a good day at work if you've wiped the floor with the opposition in question time. And we saw the speech. What did it feel like to deliver that misogyny speech in Parliament?
Yeah, I always feel like this deserves a better answer than I'm capable of giving, because it did come from a place of kind of cool anger. I did have a sense of walking into what I expected to be a question time on sexism and misogyny. I did have this sort of cool sense of, anger that after everything that I'd tolerated without responding to, now I was going to be the one sort of, charged with sexism. So it came from not a head-up place, not a, a screaming, shouting place, but a sort of centred, cool anger. And I knew it was a hard-hitting speech because I saw the opposition drop their heads, but I had no sense it would speak outside the chamber the way it did, no sense whatsoever. And that took me by unbelievable surprise in the hours and days afterwards.
We have a question upstairs.
Julia Gillard, there's much to admire about you, and I'd be the first to say that it's all true and all excellent. This is a very polite occasion, and I'm afraid I'll have to bring up a topic that will probably make you uncomfortable, but I'm committed to doing it. Do you have any regrets about the treatment of asylum seekers by Australia, to which you had contributed mightily?
Look, this is, it's fine you've raised the area, and this is one of those areas where I suspect many people in the audience aren't going to agree with me. One of the ways in which we can hold a community consensus around migration, including the humanitarian migration program, is that people feel that there's a sense of control, that, they can consent to very large migration numbers, but they know, what is happening. And it plays to people's very deep fears if they feel that that sense of control is gone. And that is not just Australians. I mean, look at what has reshaped German politics with the asylum seeker movement into Germany, and the reactions and emboldening an increase in public support for far-right politicians. This is, one of the complex political agendas of our world. And, we took the view, and Labor still takes the view, that we need to find ways of making sure we don't have large numbers of unauthorised arrivals, but that we do, this is the Labor side, have as much generosity as we can in the humanitarian program. Now, that's not going to win everybody's vote. It's going to, have a lively contest. Clearly, there is a lively debate about it between us and the Greens, for example, but that was the policy setting we adopted.
A question down the front here.
Luke Enriquez Gomes from The Guardian. First, I'll just tell you that the Prime Minister said he's going to dig in and not hold a party room meeting today. Just thought you might like to know.
The Guardian, first with the news.
On that topic, perhaps unsurprisingly, I wondered whether you had any advice for Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison heading into what's probably going to be a turbulent few days and perhaps weeks to come.
Make sure you eat some veggies, get some sunlight. It's very easy to be in Parliament House for days at a time and never get outside. Some human advice along those lines, drink a lot of water, try and dial down the coffee. The air conditioning at Parliament House, very dehydrating. But on political tactics, no. I wouldn't presume to know enough about the internal things in the Liberal Party to, give anybody any advice about what to do next.
We have a question down here.
Hi, Julia. Last year I had the great privilege of seeing Hannah Gadsby's show, Nanette, live at the Arts Centre from the 4th row. She spoke about a great many things, but one of the points she made was to call on white men to do better. You spoke in response to one of the questions about how optimistic you are for women and the particular, different lens maybe that young women today perceive their place in the world. I wonder how you view the place of men, particularly maybe privileged white men, but also male allies.
That's a really good question, and I haven't seen her show, but it seems to me...
Have to see, it's on Netflix.
Yeah, I know it's on Netflix, so it's on the list, but it seems to me almost every time that I go to the New York Times website, she's kind of on the front of it. So it really has made a huge impact, not only here but in the US. I think you are absolutely right to point to the role of men and boys in gender equality. And one of the things we're thinking about at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is, research about the best way of engaging men, and particularly men who have power, in the struggle for change. Because we do some of that, but a lot of it, I'd have to say, is more on the, male champions of change, the recognition side. What I'd really like is to, have the hard-headed comparatives, who's doing what in which business, industry, political party, university for gender change, who's making the most difference, have the stats, and then be putting the case for change to the other male leaders in a really hard-headed, you should be doing this way, to give women a real window on the working world and enable them to make some very sophisticated choices about where they want to go and put their labour. So I do think we have to harness men in this, struggle. And it actually is, if we forget about this because often the dialogue about gender is one of those areas that's, like there's only so much air in the balloon, so if you squeeze a bit more over here, then there's less here. Actually, it's not like that, Prosperity, power, being the architect of your own lives, having good relations with families and friends. These are not zero-sum games. There's not only so much that, we have to divide. These are things you can grow. And, we've got to get rid of that sort of scarcity mindset and say there's actually enough for all of us and enough for all women and men if we share it and build it together, rather than, more for me must mean less for you, which is too much how the dialogue is at the moment.
Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions. There's one up the top.
Ms. Julia Gillard, my name is Sheikh. I'm from JD program, and thank you for CIG that organizing these things. Now, the question is, there are humans and there are immortals. Now, being the very first female Prime Minister of Australia, and living as an immortal, how do you feel?
Well, I've watched enough of the sort of superhero franchises to know I'm not anywhere near immortal. You know, I'll leave that to, you know, Thor and Superman and Wonder Woman and people like that. Aquaman we've got now as well. I didn't set out. I didn't set out to make history, and I don't view myself differently, or I don't. It's not my. I don't give myself ticks in my sense of self. It doesn't play on my mind that I'm going to be in the index of books that tell the story of, you know, this part of Australia's history. That's not what matters to me. I mean, I know it's inevitably going to happen, but it's not what matters to me. What matters to me really is, you know, the change you can make while you're here, living your life as best you can. The, you know, things that'll matter to me, you know, when in that, you know, I'm going to turn 57 this year, so let's call it another 50 years when I'm on my deathbed at the ripe old age, you know, that will be. You know, what'll matter to me then is the relationships with family, friends, the loved ones who still care about me, and the things that I can still see as having an impact in the Australian community from the time that I was in office. You know, how it gets written, you know, that'll be how it is. It's not what centrally matters to me.
And final question up the front here.
Hey Julia, thank you so much for your talk. I'm here from Crikey, and I just was wondering, we've seen overseas potentially the left underestimating the power of Trump to get in, Brexit. Given that we are currently looking at a potential Prime Minister Dutton, do you think there is a concern in Australia that maybe we are underestimating his potential to get up? And what are your thoughts on, you know, his future going into the election?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to make any predictions about the federal election other than, obviously, I'll be voting for Bill Shorten and the team and advocating that people should.
There's a news grab.
There's a news grab. Who knew? But I agree with you generally that there's what I think we've underestimated, and was particularly underestimated in the US, is it's not really the power of the right and you know, the power of Donald Trump and his campaign machine. What got underestimated was people's sense of anxiety about the current state of the world, and that is felt strongly but differentially. So you work for Crikey, you said. I mean, you're probably exactly the kind of person that sees this globalised world as an array of opportunities. You've got skills and capacities that you could take to London, take to New York, take to Beijing, take to Tokyo, and you'd probably find your way in that world, you know, very satisfactorily quite quickly. Lots and lots and lots of people don't feel like that at all. They want their hometown to be like it was when they grew up. They don't want to necessarily travel too far from their hometown. Look, maybe they're interested one day in going and seeing, you know, the Eiffel Tower, but they're not going to, you know, they're not going to be people for whom the future is going to be an endless array of overseas experiences. What matters to them is, you know, family, home, community, locality, and they look at this world and say, geez, you know, how am I going to fit in? You know, what's my son going to do? Thought he was going to work at the factory, but the factory's not there anymore. What's my daughter going to do in this world that's full of, you know, changing gender relations and, traditional families and stable marriages not being the norm anymore? What's her life going to be like? And they live with this sense of fear and anxiety. And if we underestimate that, then we empower the people who will try to channel it and say all of that anxiety would go away if we, just had less trade, put some more tariffs on things. All of that anxiety would go away if we had less people from Africa in your community. All of that anxiety would go away if we just said, climate change isn't happening and what do these sort of jumped up scientists know anyway? So we vacate the field for people like that and those sorts of political messages if we don't get that anxiety. And that, I think, is the challenge for progressive forces worldwide. And I think we're pretty good at responding to economic anxiety. We're less good at finding the words to respond to anxiety about that loss of sense of self and sense of place. And that's the social democratic challenge right around the world. And we've got to be up to it.
Fantastic. Well, Julia, what a great note to finish on. Before we formally close, I want to acknowledge the assistance of all those people right across the university who've helped put today together. It's one of the great benefits of working for RMIT. In particular, I want to thank everyone at the Centre for Innovative Justice, in particular Minna Hilson, for helping organise today. And our Vice-Chancellor, Martin Bean, thank you so much for opening up proceedings. Julia, you say you don't care how history remembers you, but everyone here knows, hearing you today, and I suspect most of Australia knows, you are inspirational, you are dignified, you are a decent person, you are passionate and compassionate, and I think that's how history will remember you. I thank you so much for being such a loyal friend of mine, and thank you so much for being here today. And I have a small gift on behalf of the university. It's actually a university scarf designed by a student here at RMIT, so I hope when I see you next with Rihanna or Hillary or whoever, you've got the RMIT scarf on, otherwise you'll get one of those dirty Reuben texts from me.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we thank Julia for being with us?
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.